In part 2 of this series, we indicated that internal evidence of style is perhaps the most frequently used and most important of the tests for document authorship. But what if there's a big monkey wrench thrown into that? No, I said a big monkey wrench, not a big monkey with a wrench. As I was saying, there's one thing that can throw a lot of these arguments on style into the ringer. Here's Paul. He wants to write one of his letters. But if Paul had a secretary... no, not that kind of secretary. There. In the ancient world, a secretary was a person you hired to write something for you. Now, of course, Paul could read and write, but that didn't mean you didn't have any use for a secretary. You see, writing a document back then wasn't easy. It was slow, and involved a lot of hard work, and also, this may seem really weird, the idea of writing on a table hadn't occurred to anyone yet. So you had to use something else as a writing surface, like the ground, your leg, or, well, maybe not that desperate. Anyway, where this all fits in with our vid this time should be clear. If a secretary had a significant role in writing a letter, then of course it won't necessarily reflect the style of Paul or whoever else is using the scribe to do his work. And since this is a pretty important point, we're going to discuss two major books on the subject. Here's one author, E. Randolph Richards, author of The Secretary and the Letters of Paul. The other is Bart Ehrman, who wrote Forged. Now these two guys take a different view of this matter. Richards maintains that secretaries could take significant roles in the writing of letters, even to the point of being full-fledged composers. On the other hand, Ehrman says the evidence for this isn't good enough to use it for the New Testament, and that some kind of forgery is a better explanation for... Guys, that's enough. Okay, Dr. Richards, you can go home now. Shh, scholars. So, Bart, what's the first argument? You like that one, huh? Well, I don't know why. It's weak as dirt. Okay, argument number 2, please. You realize that by arguing that, you've undercut your own argument against secretaries taking significant part in writing ancient letters, right? Wow, that's gotta hurt. Okay, Dr. Ehrman, last one. Make it good. Come on. Sounds good, but I think you're missing something there. sorry, but I guess that throws a big monkey wrench into all of your arguments for... don't you have anything better to do? Oh. Okay, carry on. Anyway, those are just 3 of Ehrman's arguments against the secretary hypothesis. We'll look at a lot more in the supplemental article for this vid, linked in the description. And next in this series, we'll start looking at the actual New Testament books. See you then. It's been 2 years since we began our journey through the authorship issues of the New Testament. In that time, we've seen that as a whole, the evidence for the New Testament is equal to or better than that of ancient secular documents. To round things off, we're going to do a bit of comparative study, referring to a few of the New Testament documents that are almost universally acclaimed to be authentic. Then we'll dig out the arguments of a fringe critic who says that they're not, and make some comparisons. These epistles of Paul represent all that is left for us to cover in this series. They're almost universally regarded as authentic letters of Paul. Indeed, the evidence is considered so strong that some scholarly commentaries don't even bother to discuss their authorship. Or if they do, the discussion features comments like these. The sentiments these scholars express about these letters are almost universal. Yes, I said almost. No, that's not Jamie from Mythbusters. This fellow's name is Herman Detering. He's one of those wacko fringe scholars who thinks that these letters aren't authentic. What's funny, though, is that when you look at his arguments for this, you find that they're just as strained as most of the arguments against the other parts of the New Testament. Let's consider a few of them as samples. Here you go, Herman. Give him your best shot. Sure. That's one that was FedEx direct to you from the land of derp. Okay, what's next? You know what the real pretense is, Herman? Thinking you can get away with this kind of argument without doing any homework. Care to try again? I think we should put our reply in big letters too, so you can understand it. And maybe crayon also. Alright, I'll give you one more as a bonus. That's just what I expect from a guy like you who thinks a cat sat on a mat is fine poetry. So that's been your chance, Herman. I guess Mounts was right, eh? In conclusion, a couple of points to take from this. First, it is always possible, using any sort of contrivance, to argue against even a firmly held consensus position. Second, when we compare Dettering's arguments against the authenticity of letters like Galatians and Romans to arguments used against the authenticity of other New Testament material, it's clear that he's not as fringe as he seems to be when it comes to the methods he uses to argue for inauthenticity. In the end, most of the arguments are, like his, poorly informed or contrived, which leaves the burden fully on critics who deny the authenticity of the New Testament.
One autumn day, the weather was cool. We sat in our class at the Chapel Hill School. We sat in dismay through our afternoon session, as the renowned Dr. Bart delivered our lesson. The subject he raised on that day in the fall, Ephesians, Colossians, 2 letters of Paul. Or not, so he said, not one jot or tittle were written by Paul, not even a little. Then, from outside the door there came a small sound. We arose from our seats. Dr. Bart turned around. The door opened wide, with great fuss and great bustle. It was that man once again. It was Paul, the Apostle. You again, Dr. Bart mourned. Oh, please, go away. I will, Paul replied. Once I've had all my say. Let there first be no dispute about attribution, inside and outside. These are my elocutions. I agree, Bart demurred. The problem is this. Inside of those letters there are clues we can't miss. Their style so differs from letters thought true that no way exists they could be by you. At that Paul snickered. He came back with this jibe. Did you consider that in prison I might use a scribe? And more there is yet by which your theory is hung. Much within these letters would be not read, but sung. What of the words? Bart moved then to say. Selection of many, a late hand does betray. Not at all, Paul said. Not at all, not for one. What is said of these things is quite much overdone. Not so fast, Bart said with relish and glee. Those letters differ much in theology. Justification, for example, was your great concern, but in neither of these is it given a turn. So what? Paul said, his tone much appalled. Must a concern in some be a concern in all? Based on this logic upon which you insist, justification should appear on my grocery list. I've said all I'll say, and now I am through. Those letters are my letters, no matter your view. And then Paul harumphed and went on his way. He was done with his points. He'd now had his say. Well, at least this time around, Dr. Bart said, no one came in and bashed in my head.
Gee, Dr. Bart, that sure didn't look fun.
Never mind that. Just call 911.
The story of a prince and a pauper, both named Peter. Peter and Peter had much in common besides a name. Beneath their respective trappings, they both looked alike. But those trappings, they made such a difference. Peter the prince, he who we shall call Peter I, was acknowledged by all as a true Peter. But Peter the pauper, he who we shall call Peter II. That was another story, for some doubted his right to that royal name. The day would come when these two would meet, and then must it be decided which one was real.
Forsooth, you two, 'tis said that one of you has to be the real Peter who authored a letter, and the other a fake. How shall we resolve this?
I am the real Peter. His Greek is too good for a Galilean fisherman with limited education. Ha! First century Palestine was a multilingual environment, and I was a successful businessman. It surely was not beyond me to learn Greek. But even if it was, know ye not that Mark the Gospel author served as my scribe? Either he or another as well writes on my behalf.
Say, wait a minute. You're often denied authorship of your letter because your Greek is too good. but he's often denied authorship of his letter because his writing style in Greek is really bad and is nothing like yours. Forsooth, I must wonder, can it not be that yours is the Greek of an elder Galilean fisherman, while yours is that of a scribe?
Wow, I never thought of that. Yeah, cool.
Good. That's settled. What's next?
Huh. That one's letter has too many ideas that came from our friend the Apostle Paul. Surely that'd be a sign of forgery. Oh yeah? Well, you have a reference to a collection of Paul's letters, which could only happen after your lifetime. How surely that is evidence of forgery. Ah, give me that. No, you give me that.
Guys, forsooth. For you, sir, these so-called Pauline ideas, are they not better regarded as the communal property of the Christian Church rather than Paul's alone? Yea, could not also they agree that the better educated Paul had a more authoritative way of expressing Christian beliefs? And for you, sir, it says too much to suppose you speak of a collection of letters by Paul. He speaketh only of Paul having written more than one letter, which could have been said of him any time in the 50s or 60s A.D.
Yeah, but doesn't he call Paul's letters scripture?
Ah, the word used for scriptures is indeed used frequently to refer to sacred writings, but it is also a word for just about any type of written document. So now, does either of you have any further claim to inauthenticity of the other?
Well, he mentions persecution of Christians. Wouldn't it be too early for that one he wrote?
Nay, Christianity was a deviant ideological movement. It would be subject to persecution immediately. Not necessarily persecution by authorities, but certainly the sort of verbal and social harassment of the sort he indicates.
Well, he refers to our fathers. Doesn't that put him past a time when early Christians had already died off?
Ah, such is a very poor reading of what he saith. There he clearly acts as one quoting a Jewish critic, so that the fathers refers to Jewish ancestors such as Abraham and Moses. So, gentlemen, it appears I must now decide which of you is the true Peter. And I must conclude that you are twin brothers separated at birth by aliens from the planet Kadzula 5.
And that be the tale of Peter the Prince, and Peter the Pauper, and one very, very weird referee. The sun did not shine in our classroom that day. As we took in the lesson our professor conveyed, I sat there with Mary, we slumped there, aghast, as all we'd believed was slowly recast. It was Dr. Bart's class, we'd attended it daily, though his lessons would grate us like an old ukulele. He rose now and said in a voice that was flat, "Yes, Paul wrote this, but he didn't write that." And then something went thump. We arose from our slump. We looked. We saw Dr. Bart go down splat. We looked, and we saw him, the man who wrote that. I wrote these letters, he said. They're mine, I speak true. So why pay attention to what he tells you? Then Mary and I knew not what to say, for Dr. Bart had taught us a much different way. Dr. Bart said, "No, you didn't write one. The second's a fraud. Now get out and be gone." "I did write them both," said the man with the beard. "To think otherwise is upstandingly weird." Then he turned back with the speed of a skunk. The man who wrote that came back in with a trunk. Then he lifted the lid with a wave of his hand. "Now we'll discuss evidence," said the small bearded man. "I have lifted the lid, now you see something new. 2 letters, I call them Thessalonians 1 and Thessalonians 2. Both bear my name," the man said with a grin. "Do you disagree?" he asked as he pulled on Bart's chin. "Of course not," Bart growled, his voice surly and mean, as he stood there unmoving like a steel figurine. "And all others outside, do they say they are mine? To what author's name do they these letters assign?" "Yours as well," Bart grunted, his hands in his pockets, as his eyes rolled around in their reddening sockets. "Then tell me why, please, and without dramaturgy. Why is it you think Thessalonians 2 is a forgery?" "It warns against forgers," Bart declared with a scowl. "No real author would issue a warning so foul." "Do you jest?" remarked the man, his left eyebrow raised. "Such comments are known from the real letters so phrased." "The change in tone," Bart replied. "Surely in this we have the mark of a forger that we cannot dismiss." "How odd," said the man, "that you did not see. That reflects on the state of my addressee." And then the 2 letters, at the man's subtle clue, changed their guise in a spin to perform their kung fu. With that, the man nodded. He left the room with his friends. His point had been made. The conversation did end.
What's wrong, Dr. Bart?
You look really pissed.
Never you mind. Class is dismissed.
There once was an apostle with 3 little pastoral pigs, and as he had jobs for each of them to do, he sent them out to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him,
"Please, man, give me that straw to build me a house."
which the man did, and the little pig built a house with it. Presently came along a wolf, and knocked at the door, and said,
Little pig, let me in."
to which the pig answered.
"Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin."
The wolf answered,
Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
So he huffed, and he puffed. But the straw had been grown from special hybrid seed which gave it the strength and density of wrought iron. Then the little pig started dialing 911, and the wolf ran for the hills. The second little pig met a man with a bundle of sticks and said,
Please, man, give me those sticks to build a house.
which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf and said,
Little pig, let me in.
to which the pig answered.
Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin.
The wolf answered,
Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
so he huffed, and he puffed. But the sticks were of solid oak. Then the little pig pulled out a piece from his collection of laser bazookas. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks and said,
Please, man, give me those bricks to build a house.
Look, what is it with you pigs around here asking people to give you free building materials? Why don't you go to Home Depot or something? Ah, forget it.
So the man gave him the bricks, and he built the house with them. So the wolf came, as he did to the other little pigs, and said,
Little pig, let me in.
to which the pig answered.
What, are you kidding? Get out of here, you mangy flea bag.
The wolf answered,
Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in.
Go ahead, you big blowhard.
well, he huffed and he puffed, and he huffed and he puffed, and he puffed and huffed. Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared he would eat up the little pig, and that he would get down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung on the pot full of water, and made up a blazing fire. And that would be the story of the three little pastoral pigs. And they lived happily ever after.
Little pigs, let us come in.
Well, almost, anyway.
Hey there, everyone. We're working on a fun one for this series involving another Dr. Seuss parody. In the meantime, we decided to keep it going with one that's fairly short and simple. Here's Dr. Bart again. We've issued him a challenge concerning the authenticity of the epistles of John. Ready, Dr. Bart? Okay. The challenge is that we can argue for the authenticity of all 3 epistles of John faster than you can eat 6 mega-nuclear suicide death wings from Barky's Neighborhood Grill. Ready? Go. Okay, we're done. How's Bart doing with those wings? Bart? Oh well, we'll take them if you don't want them. Thanks. Piquant.
It's the Authorship game, and here is your authorial host, James Patrick Holding!
Thank you. Good evening, folks. Welcome to the Authorship game, where we pair up authors with anonymous documents. Let's begin by meeting our 3 authors. Johnny?
Thanks, JP! Author 1 tonight is from the great city of Tarsus, where he makes tents and studies the Torah. In his spare time, he likes skydiving and playing tiddlywinks. And he's also recognized as the unofficial record holder for the most finger push-ups at Pharisee University. Please welcome Paul! Author 2 hails from the Roman colony of Philippi. He's a successful physician who enjoys sea travel, and when he's not doing that, he likes to trim his toenails. Please welcome Luke! And here's Author 3. This young man calls Alexandria, Egypt, his home. He's got a career as a public speaker and teacher. He collects mouthwash bottles, and he's recently been given a grant to study lima beans. Here he is, Apollos!
Thank you, Chuck. Now it's time to meet our anonymous document for the evening. And here she is, the letter to the Hebrews. Hello there.
Hi, Mr. Holding.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm kind of a longish letter. My main theme is how Christ fulfills the promises of the Old Testament and the Jewish cultic rituals. And I also have one of the most specific Christologies in the New Testament.
Oh, that's pretty fascinating. Okay, well, let's get started, and you all know the rules. Our letter here will ask you authors some questions, and at the end she picks one of you for her author. And they'll win what, Johnny?
JP, our lucky winners tonight will receive an all-expenses-paid trip to the Grand Slapavia Resort in sunny Tierra del Fuego. Plus, they'll also receive this washer and dryer, a very inexpensive radio, and a year's supply of lint.
Whoa, that's one of our better prize packages of late. Okay, Ms. Hebrews, you can get started with the questions.
Okay, let's start with author number 1. Number 1, who says you're my author?
Well, to be honest, there are only a couple of people, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who say I was your author. But they also say that someone else acted as my scribe.
Oh, really? Who?
Him.
Luke, really? That's interesting. 2 people say Paul was your author and that he used Luke as your scribe. Huh.
Well, only Clement says that specifically. Origen just reports that others say I was the scribe.
Well, that takes care of my question for number 2. Number 3, let me ask you the same question. Who says you're my author?
Well, actually, no one suggested me as your author until Martin Luther.
Number 1, if you were a tree in the forest, what kind of tree would you be?
A bald cypress.
Good one. Number 2, you say you're a physician, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, then my question to you is, what is the highest prime number which corresponds with the square root of the hypotenuse between your office door and the top of Mount Olympus?
Oh yeah, that would be 31.
Smarty pants. Okay, number 3, I'd like to ask you, if your house was on fire, what 3 things would you try to save?
I live in a condominium.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Fine with me. Number 1, what internal evidence of content is given for and against you being my author?
Well, the main evidence for is that you have a lot of ideas similar to mine. But there's an awful lot more evidence against. Your writing style is way unlike mine, though of course that could mean I had a scribe to help. But maybe the strongest evidence against is your passage in chapter 2, verse 3, which speaks of the author as being one of those who heard Jesus. It might be stretching things a bit to say it refers to my encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road.
Okay. Number 2, let me ask you the same question, please.
Well, your writing style and language has affinities with mine.
Oh, that's pretty good evidence.
Well, to be fair, your author seems to have a lot more proficiency with the Old Testament.
Aww. Oh well. Now last, number 3, what's your answer to that question?
Well, I'm from Alexandria, and you do show some affinities with Alexandrian philosophical and theological thought. And you're also eloquent and bold and proficient with the scriptures, just like a lot of people say I am.
Aw, that was a sweet thing to say. Thanks.
Okay, so Ms. Hebrews, now you have to make your choice. Will it be author number 1, author number 2, or author number 3?
Why can't I pick all 3 of them?
Beg pardon?
Well, sure. I mean, why not? Origen and Clement already say I was a team effort.
Gentlemen, you're all going to Tierra del Fuego. So that's all for this episode of the Authorship Game. Tune in next week when our document will be the novel Primary Colors. See you next time. Hey folks, it seems that Bart Ehrman here wants a rematch of our contest involving the authorship of the letters of John. That right, Bart? So, you think you're better prepared this time? What's that? Flamin' Fred's Ultra Super Duper Ghost Habanero Scotch Bonnet and Garlic Morgue Filler Sauce. Oh, so you've been practicing, huh? Not bad. Okay, we'll now pick the mode of challenge at random from this jar. Okay, this time the challenge will be that we'll give all the evidence for the authenticity of the letter of James before you can walk back and forth across this pond infested with alligators. Go. Okay, we're done. Ah, you made it at the same time we finished. Well, I guess that means we go to the tiebreaker. I'll just pick another contest slip from this jar and... Okay, the tiebreaker is... Oh, crud. I'll never be able to win... Bart? Where'd he go? Oh well, see you next time. Of the four Gospels, one offers the most complex case in terms of discernment of authorship. But it's not so much a case of too little evidence, as too many choices. As is typical of the New Testament books, there's no dispute in terms of internal evidence of attribution when it comes to John's Gospel. The critical question is raised by the external evidence of attribution. Which John was the author? The early church writer Papias made this comment you see here. It's occasioned some debate over whether Papias is referring to two different Johns, one a disciple of the Lord, the other an elder, or whether he's referring to just one John twice, who is both a disciple and an elder. A couple of other external testimonies favor the first explanation and directly identify the John of the Gospel with the disciple. Others are equivocal, and none identify the author as merely an elder named John. In contrast, there's a fairly large collection of arguments attempting to show that the Apostle John could not be the author of his Gospel. A good number of these, though sometimes still heard today, are badly out of date. For example, it used to be fashionable to declare that John's Gospel was Gnostic in orientation, meaning it reflected the beliefs of a mystical religious system in the ancient world characterized by the idea that one needed special knowledge, or gnosis, to be saved. That in turn was taken to mean John could not be the author. This fellow, Rudolf Bultmann, was really big on this idea, and he's so well known for making issues over John's Gospel that we'll use him as our bad guy the rest of the way. But anyway, as to this argument, since deeper study of Judaism has occurred since Bultmann's day, it's become clear that John is firmly rooted in Judaism, not Gnosticism. A more tangible objection appeals to Acts 4:13 and says that because this indicates John was illiterate, he couldn't have written a Gospel. Well, as we've noted in a prior vid, that won't wash because all John needed was a scribe. Beyond that, there's 2 points. 1. Illiteracy is a social problem, not an incurable disease. Even if John was illiterate in 33 AD, at the time of Acts 4:13, that doesn't mean he stayed illiterate for the next 30 years. But besides that, Acts 4:13 couldn't refer to literacy, for how could the priest have known from a speech that John and Peter couldn't write? All Acts 4:13 means is that Peter and John were not formally schooled, as would indeed be obvious, not that they couldn't read and write. Then there's this objection. Within John, the figure of John is referred to as the disciple Jesus loved. The argument goes that a self-description like this seems a little, well, egotistical for John himself to write, but this incorrectly assumes modern social values on the text. Egotism, as we understand it, wasn't part of their social world. In contrast, people were expected to be bold and frank and honest about what they were. So, if Jesus did indeed truly love this disciple, then that disciple was free to say so. After this, the objections start getting a little silly and nitpicky. For example, some complain that John 18:13 is wrong because it reflects a notion that there was a new high priest every year. Yeah, right, look here. If I say, 1977, Jimmy Carter was president that year, does that mean I think the presidents are elected every year? No, of course not. Even so, you have to know something else to appreciate the point John is likely making. 28 men held the office of high priest between 37 BC and 70 AD, meaning most lasted an average of only 2.75 years. In that light, a phrase like, that year, might not have been an inappropriate way of putting things. Finally, we'll mention this verse, which is said to reflect a benediction cursing Christians that was used in synagogues only after 85 AD. Too late, some say, for John to have written, or else showing that the Gospel was not authored by an eyewitness like John. But look carefully. The benediction of 85 AD was a curse, not an expulsion. There was no ban on the attendance of synagogue by Christians. But the expulsion of deviant persons from a group was simply a typical process in the ancient world, so that there is no specific date past which Christians could have been subject to an expulsion. So once again, we see that by applying the standard test of authorship, the Gospel of John comes out as good as any ancient document. There's one other question we could address, and that's why John's Gospel is so different from the others. But we'll save that for another vid. Well, folks, it seems Dr. Ehrman wants one last try at winning a challenge. Is that right, Bart? Bart? Huh. Where is he? Oh, there you are. Yeah, pretty impressive outfit. Okay, we'll just take out one of these slips and... Right, the challenge is that we'll present the evidence for the authorship of the Epistle of Jude before you can thread this delicate needle. Go. Okay, we're done. How'd you do there, Bart? No good, huh? Well, maybe you'd like to just argue the opposite viewpoint? Oh well, see you next time. Few are inclined to doubt the attribution of the companion volumes of Luke and Acts to a person named Luke. The focus instead by critics is to deny Luke access to the apostolic circle. Not surprisingly, all copies of Luke's Gospel name Luke as the author. Acts itself has no attribution, but other than a few oddballs, it is the overwhelming consensus that Luke is the author, and as well the best candidate among Paul's listed companions to be culled from the traveling group designated by we in Acts. Externally, there is a healthy roster of testimony. Traditionally, Luke has been identified as a physician, and certain aspects of Luke Acts point in that direction. The author of Luke Acts is clearly cultured. His Greek is the best in the New Testament, and he knows Greco-Roman rhetorical techniques. That he had the leisure to write a 2-volume account at least points to a person of independent means, or perhaps a retainer of a well-to-do person. And the author was a person of high sensitivity and empathy. All of this, especially the latter, fits quite well with our picture of Luke as a physician. We should mention one argument that is not useful in this regard. In the past, there were some arguments that Luke's vocabulary reflected the specialized language of a physician, but further analysis has shown that Luke's language is simply that of an educated person of his day, which of course a physician would be. The critical question, though, is not so much who was, but when, and thus whether he was connected to a member of the apostolic circle, namely Paul. If Luke Acts was written early, then a connection to Paul is possible, but if it was written late, the connection to Paul disappears. So, what evidence indicates an earlier date for Luke Acts? The most critical point in favor is the abrupt ending of Acts, with Paul waiting to go to trial at Rome. If Acts was written past the date this would correspond with, circa 62 AD, we would expect to have heard more of Paul's fate, but we don't. And it's difficult to believe, in light of Luke's careful accounting of the martyrdoms of Stephen and James, the brother of John, that Luke would have stopped Acts right there if he had known at that writing of Paul's execution under Nero a few years later. This is pretty strong evidence, so what can be said against it? One objection is that Luke just didn't report Paul's execution because he was trying to keep from making the Romans angry. Yeah, that would make sense, except that he reports... And if he wasn't afraid of that angering the Romans, well, you can make the connection. A more convoluted argument is that it was Luke's literary intention to simply show how the commission to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth was fulfilled, so the arrival and preaching of Paul at Rome is more than a fitting ending for his literary purpose. But this argument can then be taken a step further and defeated. There's also a theme in Acts of the equality of Peter and Paul. If Luke Acts was written after their executions, what better way to demonstrate this than to end with both martyrdoms in Rome? In addition, if Luke's readers knew that Paul had been martyred, then he has ended Acts in the worst possible way for inspiring confidence and commitment in his readers. Ending the work on an upbeat note, when it is known that Paul went on to be executed, is like writing a biography of a soldier who went heroically to war in order to exemplify and encourage patriotism, and omitting the fact that he was killed in action. In turn, what can be said to argue that Luke Acts was written too late for Luke to have been a member of Paul's circle, or to argue that he wasn't part of that circle? As a closeout, I want to briefly discuss a point sometimes used to date Luke Acts after 70 AD, one that shows some scholars sometimes live too long in ivory towers. Under the assumption that Mark wrote his gospel first, much is made of how Luke allegedly changed the emphasis of Mark 13 from the destruction of the temple and the Antichrist figure to the destruction of Jerusalem. But wait a minute. The temple was inside the walls of Jerusalem. If Jesus was predicting the destruction of the temple in Mark, then it logically follows that he must also have predicted the destruction, or at the very least the invasion, of Jerusalem, since an army is not going to peacefully hop over or pass through the walls of Jerusalem and just attack the temple, right? Yeah, I have a lot of respect for most scholars, but some of them need to get out more. See ya. Questions about the authorship of Mark's Gospel usually don't concern the identity of the author. Rather, most questions focus on the reliability of Mark as an authoritative source that had connections to the apostolic circle. As with most of the New Testament books, the evidence here is unambiguous. All copies of Mark designate Mark as the author, and there is a longer than usual list of external testimonies. As can be readily seen, this testimony indicates that Mark acted as a sort of scribe for Peter, recording his own account of events. So the key question here would have to be, how much does Mark's Gospel reflect the authority of Peter? In practical terms, it's pretty clear that Peter stands out as the star of Mark's Gospel, after Jesus, of course. Peter's mentioned more times pro rata in Mark than in the other Gospels, and his character is the most true to life after Jesus. Many third-person verses, if shifted to first or second person, would fit right in Peter's mouth. And of course, 1 Peter 5:13 indicates that Mark was at least sometimes a companion of Peter. In addition, Mark's text indicates that someone very like Peter, as we would recognize him, was behind it. Mark's Gospel has the most limited vocabulary. It was written in man-on-the-street Koine Greek. It also bears the signs of having as its source someone without a great deal of education. Sorry, Pete, no offense. In short, it bears the hallmarks of a peasant fisherman. Not that that's a bad thing. So what can be said to dispute this identification? Well, it gets silly pretty quickly. The most popular arguments involve, are you ready for this? Geography. Yeah, according to some critics, you can see that Peter wasn't behind this gospel because it has some geographical errors. Yeah, okay, guys, that's enough. How about we check out the usual suspects then? And so that's the cream of the crop from the critics when it comes to Mark. Pretty sad, isn't it? Nice kitty. That's a boy. These are symbols of the four Gospels. As we noted in a previous vid, two of these four are frequently questioned in terms of their authorship. It's time we had a look at one of them. Matthew is unique in this respect, because it's the one New Testament book that has any issues whatsoever in terms of internal evidence of attestation. The problem is that our earliest copy of Matthew, a 3rd century manuscript designated P1, doesn't ascribe authorship to anyone. The reason this isn't a big deal is because P1 likely had its origins in a scroll copy of Matthew, where the authorship would be designated by an external tag. Now, perhaps if P1 stood alone without the additional evidence we're going to discuss, it might make for a persuasive point against Matthean authorship, but it's far from the only evidence in play. When it comes to external evidence of attestation, Matthew turns out to be a goldmine, and we have testimony that predates the copy called P1. Here's a list of church authors that affirm that Matthew authored a gospel. Now, one interesting point which is relevant is that when we collect this testimony, we find that it was believed that the Matthew we have in Greek was derived from another document that was in one of the native languages of Palestine, either Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, some may object that Greek Matthew shows no signs of having been translated from one of those Palestinian languages, but that's not necessarily true. Some scholars, like the Greek specialist Daniel Wallace, say that they find traces of those languages in Matthew's Greek. But even if Wallace is wrong, a writer who was very proficient in Greek, like the Jewish historian Josephus, didn't necessarily leave any signs of having translated his source material. If Matthew is a tax collector, as his own gospel indicates, then he would have been likely a very proficient bilingual. So even if his Greek doesn't look translated, that doesn't mean his original text wasn't written in Hebrew or Aramaic. There are a few internal clues for Matthew's authorship, but those that I find the strongest are the ones that confirm that his gospel is the product of someone just as we describe Matthew to be, a former tax collector who also has extensive training in the Jewish religion. First, Matthew more frequently references money than any other gospel, and uses unique monetary terms not found in the synoptic parallel accounts. That means he's either a nerd, or an accountant, or, well, a tax collector. Second, based on information in the Gospels, Matthew's original name was Levi, which in turn indicates that he was by ancestry a member of the priestly tribe of Levi. Normally such a person would have a proper Jewish religious training, and Matthew's Gospel shows evidence of this in the way he makes use of the Old Testament and the way he deals with issues related to Judaism. But here's the catch. There would be only so many jobs available for a trained Levite, and someone like Matthew might be forced to seek employment elsewhere. Given his educational level, one possible job for such a person would be tax collector. And in line with that, Matthew's Gospel also indicates someone who is a Hellenized Jew, one influenced by Greek style and society. That's some pretty good internal evidence, better than we have for many ancient documents. But now let's look at a couple of the best internal arguments against Matthew's authorship. Many of these arguments broadly follow an outline like this. Some element in Matthew could only have been written after 70 AD. The historical Matthew would have been dead by 70 AD. Therefore, he could not have written the Gospel with his name on it. Chief in these arguments, and one often used to date all the Gospels late, is that Matthew has Jesus showing knowledge of the war against Rome in AD 70. Now obviously only a denial of predictive prophecy lies behind such arguments. Once this barrier is cleared, these additional points can be made which diffuse charges of prophecy written after the fact. First, the context of Jesus' statements indicates the time before the temple was destroyed. Passages in the Gospels refer to the temple in present tense, or in a very casual way that suggests that it is still standing. The story of the fish and the coin in particular would have been irrelevant once the temple had been destroyed, and indeed highly problematic, since after 70 the temple tax went to support the pagan temple of Jupiter in Rome. Second, a prediction of the destruction of the temple is hardly unique. Destruction of the temple, or of Jerusalem, would not be too wild a guess, in light of how turbulent relations with the Romans were in Jesus' time. Several contemporaries of Jesus made similar predictions. The most familiar of these predictors, mentioned by Josephus, was Jesus the son of Ananias, a bit of a madman who made predictions of the temple's destruction between 63 and 70 AD. Prior to Jesus' time, there were also predictions of the temple being destroyed found in the Old Testament, and in the intertestamental book of 2 Maccabees. It just didn't take much to see those events coming, any more than it took prophetic genius for the American politician John Calhoun to see in 1847 that conditions in the USA were such that the result might someday be civil war. So just because Matthew records Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, that doesn't mean we have to date his gospel after 70, and therefore also deny Matthew his gospel. There are a few other lesser arguments to date Matthew late, but we'll just pick one in particular as typical of what can be found, in that it's pretty weak and nitpicky. In Matthew 27:8 and 28:15, Matthew refers to conditions in 30 AD or so that are still as they are to this day. Some critics suggest that this means a late date. But how long can we wait before saying, to this day? Wouldn't 30 years, meaning a 60 AD date for Matthew, be sufficient? Or even 20 years, which would be a 50 AD date? Right now, we're only 22 years past the destruction of the Berlin Wall. And would it be wrong to say that it remains destroyed to this day? So that's what I'd say are two of the best arguments made against Matthew's Gospel being by Matthew. There are others, but they're pretty bad. And you can see some of those dealt with in materials linked to in the vid description. See you next time. Okay, so tonight we've assembled an expert panel to discuss the question of who authored Revelation. We have from Revelation chapter 4, this thing, and from Revelation chapter 9, another thing, and finally this other thing from what chapter?
Revelation 13.
Okay, cool. Now, thing number one, do you want to comment on the internal evidence of attestation?
Yeah, sure. Well, oddly enough, Revelation has the best internal evidence of attestation of any New Testament book. The name of John is found multiple times within the text. The only real question is which John it is.
That's true. And for that, we turn to external evidence of attestation. Thing number two?
Yeah, that's pretty solid too. We have lots of witnesses, and they really help clarify what John is in mind. Check these out.
Pretty impressive. That just leaves internal evidence of content. Thing number three?
Pretty sparse actually, both pro and con. On the one hand, it's said that Revelation's language and style is way different than that of John's Gospel. Thing is, though, that fits in with John being in exile on Patmos where he wouldn't have a scribe to help him out. And as different as that language and style is, Revelation and John's Gospel do share a lot of imagery and words. Check this out.
Well, I guess it boils down to this. It's pretty much agreed that the author of Revelation was a Palestinian Jew who knew his Old Testament, he was familiar with the genre of apocalyptic, and he was a native Aramaic speaker. Seems to me that John the son of Zebedee, a native Jewish fisherman with connections to the high priest, fits as well as or better than anyone. Any comment, panel? Okay, wrap party. Actually, we still want to do something for this series on Hebrews and some closing comments. But hey, how can you not have a party with a crazy group like this around? So, how much do we make of claims like these? And how serious are they? Well, some would say it doesn't matter who wrote the New Testament, and for them that may be all right. But these criticisms show that for some people, authorship is also a matter of authority. "27 books. That's what makes up the New Testament. Although, we'll delete Hebrews from the list because it doesn't have an author listed. Of the 26 books left, well, how many do you think get regularly questioned in terms of who wrote them?"
I hate Smurfs. Ow, ow, ow.
If you count those up, you'll find that's 14 out of 26, over half of the New Testament. And some of the others are questioned too, less frequently. A problem? That it is. So let's start finding an answer. One of the things I've noticed about critics who say that this or that book of the New Testament is bogus is that they seldom seem to explain in any detail how we decide who wrote a document. There are ways to decide that. Evidence that is considered when deciding who the author of a document is. Let's have a look at how that evidence works. And as a sort of control, we're going to use two other documents from outside the New Testament. One an ancient document, one a modern one. For our ancient document, we're going to select one by a fellow who is regarded as the greatest historian ancient Rome ever produced. No. Ah, there he is. This is Tacitus. And here are some vital statistics about him. What we're going to do is look at the evidence that he wrote his book called the Annals, a history of Rome that covers from about the 30s to the 60s in the 1st century. All modern historians agree that Tacitus wrote the Annals, and if the evidence for the Annals is good enough to say Tacitus wrote it, then a document with better evidence should have no questions about its authorship. Now the modern book, and I'm going to pick on a friend of mine here, Christian apologist Lee Strobel. He's written a number of books, but we'll be looking at the evidence that he wrote his book called The Case for Christ. These two guys are separated in history by a good amount, and they wrote about way different topics. But we'll see that the tests for deciding who wrote their books are essentially the same. Okay, so, here's the book, The Case for Christ. What's our first clue that it was written by Lee Strobel? That's right, his name is on it. This is what we would call internal evidence of attribution. What does the work say itself in terms of who wrote it? Now what might cause us to doubt this information? Well, let's say that we discovered a secret warehouse at Zondervan Books, and we found a bunch of copies of The Case for Christ that looked like this. If these copies of Case for Christ are old enough, they might be good evidence to raise doubts that Lee Strobel was the author. But, of course, there are no copies of Case for Christ by Elmo Thudpucker. All of them say Lee Strobel. What about Tacitus and his Annals? Well, yes, here again the answer is the same. All copies of the Annals say that Tacitus is the author. But there's an important extra point we want to add when it comes to this book. You see, there's only one place in the Annals where it says that Tacitus is the author, and that's at the very beginning of the book where it says, The Annals of Tacitus in the title. Be sure and keep that in mind for later when we look at the evidence for the New Testament books. In part 1 of this series, we closed by talking about internal evidence of attribution, what a book says about itself in terms of who wrote it. Well, you can probably guess what this test is all about. Yep, it's what other people say about who wrote a book. Take Case for Christ. There's all kinds of people who will say Lee Strobel wrote this book. His editors, professional book reviewers, his wife and kids, even other apologists like me. All of those amount to external evidence that Lee Strobel wrote his book. And of course, there's no one out there who says it was written by Elmo Thudpucker. Pretty simple. Now when it gets to the Annals of Tacitus, things are a little more complicated. The Annals were probably published in 116 AD. The first mention we have of Tacitus writing anything by name comes from the 3rd century, between 200 and 300 AD. A Christian writer named Tertullian gives Tacitus credit not for the Annals, but for his other historical work, the Histories. This is the first direct attribution we have of something to Tacitus, and it's over 100 years later. Tertullian also cited Tacitus in 2 other places, and as the years pass, there are a number of signs that different writers knew of Tacitus or read his work, but we don't get a clear indication that he wrote the Annals from any of those. It's much later before anyone says anything to show that Tacitus wrote the Annals. That only happens when the Church Father Jerome, who lived between 340 and 420 AD, refers to 30 books of history by Tacitus. The Annals and the Histories comprise 30 books together, so it's pretty clear he means the Annals. Keep all of this in mind again when we start to look at the books of the New Testament. Now before we let this one go, there is a caveat when it comes to this test. Someone's testimony as to who wrote a book isn't much good unless they're in a position to know who wrote it. So, for example, while one of Lee Strobel's editors would be in a good position to know whether or not he wrote Case for Christ, some other people, well, they wouldn't be such good sources for that information. Hey, did you hear that Lee Strobel has a new book coming out? Actually, I just made this one up. But it's a good way to illustrate our next test, internal evidence of content. Basically, a test based on whether what's in a book matches with what we know about the author. There's 2 aspects to this. One subjective, one objective. My gag here with Lee Strobel illustrates the subjective test, which has to do with things like writing style, or the way an author presents their material. It might be said, for example, that this book couldn't possibly be by Strobel because it doesn't sound like the way he writes. Or maybe that he doesn't write horror fiction for children. Points like that deserve consideration, but they also can't be given more weight than they deserve, because they put writers in a box under the assumption that the author could possibly be very versatile. There's plenty of examples that could be given of why that won't work, even with me. You see, I write a lot of books and articles on very serious subjects, with a lot of footnotes and academic references sometimes. But on the other hand, I also do this. Yep, in case you didn't know, all this art in these videos is mine. And I have my own webcomics too. The Annals of Hearthstone, as opposed to the Annals of Tacitus, I guess. Now for the objective test. For this one, we'll use Tacitus again. The annals are about events in the 1st century AD. So let's put it this way. If we read in the annals that Emperor Nero opened a refrigerator, took out a burrito, and stuck it in the microwave oven, we certainly have some cause to doubt that a 2nd century author like Tacitus was responsible. What these amount to are what we call anachronisms. Things are out of place in a text because they reflect things past an author's time. So that's a sum of test of internal evidence of content. Before we go, I'll just mention that it's this test more than any other that is used to doubt the authorship of New Testament books. But we'll talk more about that next time. First two parts of this series, we looked at the 3 criterion for deciding authorship of a document. Our next step will be...
Dah, this ain't told us nothing about any of the New Testament books. What a waste of time.
See, now, that's exactly the kind of head-in-the-sand attitude that causes people to make bad arguments about this. Here, beat it. As I was saying, to argue about the authorship of these books, you have to have certain rules. That's why we spent this series so far talking about what those rules are. And yes, we'll get to the New Testament books. After this, we'll start a series of vids devoted to each of the disputed books. And we'll include arguments used by some well-known popular sources. But to close out this introduction, we're going to apply our tests as a demonstration to 2 documents. One that scholars are sure is authentic, and another that they are sure is not authentic. On the authentic side, well, we know this guy. It's Cornelius Tacitus again. How's it shaking, Corny? Yeah, he hates when I do that. On the other side, this is the Apostle Thomas, supposedly. Okay, gents, what do we have to offer? Huh. Okay, it seems we have a tie. Not surprising. Internal evidence of attribution is really more of a starting point than a proof of authorship. You might say it lays a burden on those who want to argue for someone else's author. Let's move on. Gentlemen? Oh dear, there seems to be a problem. All of the external evidence says that the Gospel of Thomas is a fake. Well, that's all right. We still have one more to go. Gentlemen? What's that? We need to explain? Okay. So it seems that the Gospel of Thomas shows every evidence of not having been written by the Apostle Thomas. So who do you suppose... Dr. Martzer, what are you... Ah, that would explain a lot.
I would have got away with it, too, if it hadn't been for you meddling scholars.
Seriously though, folks, no one knows who wrote the so-called Gospel of Thomas. There are a lot of theories, and we'll discuss those someday. For now, look for the next installment in our series on one or more of these books. Later.